What is going on? Thank you for tuning in, and I hope you're doing well. Now we're back in the collection room for an extra special episode tonight as I give you my figure-by-figure review of one of the action figure lines, one of the toy lines, one of the things in general that define my childhood. I'm talking about Hasbro WWF action figures. As the world of the WWF transitioned from the 80s to the 90s, the wackiness of the characters, the gimmicks and the storylines was dialed up to the next level. And while this era of wrestling wasn't for everybody, as a kid who was born in the mid-80s, I was at the perfect age to really appreciate what was going on in the World Wrestling Federation at the time, as the heroes, the top billed stars, were real-life superheroes to me and a whole generation of young wrestling fans. And at this point in time, merchandising and licensing was exploding, and with the in-ring action targeting more of a child-aged audience, the WWF needed a big presence on toy store shelves. And for that, they partnered with Hasbro to deliver a product that was very different to what had been seen previously with LJN's 8-inch rubber figures. In 1990, Hasbro released their first series of the 4-inch plastic articulated action figures with spring-loaded action features. And like I mentioned in previous videos where we've spoken about WWF Hasbros, in my opinion, the wacky and cartoony style of the Hasbro WWF action figure line perfectly represented that era of wrestling, and it was one of my favorite action figure lines growing up. So I'm excited today to give you my figure-by-figure review of Wave 1, the first 12 Hasbro WWF figures that we got. And if we're talking about WWF in 1990, who better to start with than the Hulkster himself, Hulk Hogan. As we start in 1990, Hogan is still very much the face of the company. Hulkamania has reached its peak, he's their top boy, and he's still wearing the WWF strap. And here we've got a pretty good representation of Hulk Hogan in Hasbro's first attempt at the figure. Instantly recognizable, ticks all the boxes as far as the Hulkster's apparel and entrance gear, and that's a pretty common theme throughout the Hasbro WWF line. For the most part, the wrestlers are depicted in their entrance attire, but I think that personally just makes them more recognizable and just more of a quintessential depiction of everything that made up the wrestler's appearance. So we've got the tearaway Hulk Rule singlet, we've got, all of the yellow and red attire going, boots, we've got the red headband. Face likeness is pretty good. I think this is a good likeness representation of Hulk Hogan. I've mentioned in previous videos where we've spoken about the Hasbros that they're not necessarily like perfect scale representations of the wrestlers, but they capture the characters, and that's, I think, very much what we have going on with Hulk Hogan here. Now, I mentioned this spring-loaded action feature. Hulk's is the spring-loaded Gorilla Press, which to me is a little bit of an odd choice because I don't necessarily remember Hulk Hogan doing the Gorilla Press. Obviously a big power slam guy, had some very famous body slams in his career. Not so much the Gorilla Press, but hey, I'm nitpicking there. But I must say, thinking about this as a kid, if I had have had the Series 1 figures as a kid, I came along into wrestling and into the Hasbro line a little bit later. So none of these figures that we're looking at today were in my childhood collection. So we're going to be talking about the figures more on their own merits as opposed to my personal memories of them. With that said, when I played with the Hasbros as a kid, I didn't necessarily use a lot of the spring-loaded action features. And thinking about if I had have had this figure as a kid, this might have kind of interfered with play a little bit because you're not going to be throwing punches or clotheslines with these open palm hands down by the sides. But hey, as far as display goes, a beautiful looking Hogan figure, an iconic figure from Series 1 of Hasbro WWF. So we've got Hulk Hogan in the books first. Next up, who better to go with than the man that took the title from Hulk Hogan partway through 1990. Of course, I'm talking about one of my childhood favorites, The Ultimate Warrior. Now, I was absolutely a little warrior as a kid in the 1990s. I'm repping the Warrior today with my t-shirt. I absolutely loved him. When I rented Wrestlemania VI from the video store, I was cheering for the Ultimate Warrior. I loved Hogan growing up, but the Warrior was my guy. So big fan of the Warrior. Am I a big fan of this figure? Absolutely not. I'm going to say from the waist up, it is a respectable attempt at the Ultimate Warrior. We've got a nice upper body physique. The face paint, the wild hair, that's captured respectably. But to me, this is a big miss. The Ultimate Warrior is just a character that lends itself so great to action figures. The Ultimate Warrior was like a comic book character come to life. The Ultimate Warrior could have been in Masters of the Universe with defining features like brightly colored attire, outrageous face paint. Just lends itself perfectly to an action figure. But I think Hasbro dropped the ball on this one, mainly for the lower half. I've mentioned previously when I'm talking about Hasbro pickups and just touching on the Hasbro line throughout other videos on this channel, I hate this fused leg spring-loaded torso action feature. I don't like any figures in the line that have this. Some of them are understandable, like when you have the Rockers, when you have high-flying characters, Superfly Jimmy Snuka a little bit later on, characters, wrestlers that were known to go launching off the top rope. I think this does make sense. For the Ultimate Warrior, obviously he had his big splash, but that wasn't necessarily a top rope move, so I don't get it. Like I said, there's some redeeming features here in the upper body and the face sculpt, facial expression, the hair. Okay, cool. I like the actual coloured outfit. I like the lime green and the hot pink. That works great for me, but just this sculpt is a bit of a miss. And what you tend to have when you have the fused leg spring-loaded torso is you have this big lump in the back, which I guess, you use with your index finger to play out that action feature. As a kid in my Fig Federation, as a young fella, I had a couple of figures that used this action feature and I just never used it. I used my imagination, what we all did back in the day. So anyway, not a figure that I love, a wrestler that I love, a character that I loved growing up, but a bit of a miss as far as Hasbro goes, if I'm being perfectly honest. Still one that I'm happy to have in the collection though. Next up, we've got a character that was still very much at the top of the card in 1990, and I'm talking about the Macho Man Randy Savage. This is a figure that I love from head to toe. I think the likeness is great. I love that head sculpt with the orange bandana and the sunnies, the iconic orange trunks with the stars, the yellow boots. This feels like late 80s Macho Man, Mega Powers Macho Man, which tells me that these figures were in development a little bit earlier on than when they came out, which would make sense because if I remember correctly, in 1990, we had the Macho King Randy Savage. We had a different gimmick and a different look. So this is more reminiscent of the Mega Powers era, but just a great looking figure. This has a far more simple action feature in the kind of hammer fist on both sides. That's not going to get in the way of play. If you were to have this figure as a kid, you could use it or you could not use it, and it wouldn't be a big deal. We've got closed fists, so we can throw some punches, we can have some fun with this figure. We have two separate legs, which is a bonus when it comes to the Hasbro. So just an all-round great figure and one that I'm really happy to have in the collection. Next up, we've got one of my favorite bad guys of the WWF of my childhood, and I'm talking about the $1 Million Man, Ted Dibiase. If I remember correctly, Ted Dibiase wasn't necessarily in the title picture in 1990, but in 1990 and right throughout my childhood, he was always good for a feud and he was always good for some quality in-ring work, but just making a great foil to a lot of the heroes of the WWF of my childhood. And with Dibiase, we've got another example, like I mentioned earlier, of a lot of these wrestlers being depicted in their entrance attire. In Dibiase's case, we've got the iconic black tuxedo with the gold lapels with the dollar signs on them. I don't think this would have bothered me as a kid. I mean, in my Hasbro Fig Fed, when I was younger, I had one of the later Dibiase figures that were released, but it was still in a tuxedo, in a different version of the tuxedo, and it never bothered me because to me, it's just how Ted Dibiase is most easily recognized. As a kid, I used to always have a chuckle when he took the jacket off and he didn't have the full shirt on, he just had the actual chest part of the shirt attached to the collar. I always had a laugh when he got ready for a match and you saw that. But just a great looking figure and a pretty simple action feature. You know, just an uppercut there, which works well. Like I said, not getting in the way of any play if I had this figure as a kid. A good play pose and a great accessory. So here we look at the first accessory in Series 1, and just a great looking $1 Million Championship belt, which as a kid would let you play out all sorts of angles, like Jake the Snake Roberts stealing the belt or Virgil winning the belt. So between Series 1 Ted DiBiase and his $1 Million Championship belt, an excellent figure. Next up, we've got the 8th wonder of the world himself, Andre the Giant. Now by 1990, Andre the Giant was well and truly on his way out. In fact, Wrestlemania VI, which we mentioned earlier when we were talking about Hulk Hogan and the Ultimate Warrior, Wrestlemania VI was one of Andre's last in-ring appearances, and even then, his tag team partner, his Colossal Connection tag team partner, Haku, did most of the work. So Andre was on his way out, but absolutely a living legend, a pop culture icon. So I'm really happy that Andre the Giant got the Hasbro treatment, and I think Hasbro nailed this figure. The scale is fantastic. Now, like I mentioned, Hasbro for the WWF line, they weren't particularly sticklers for scale. A lot of the figures are the same size, but Andre scales perfectly, towering over Hulk Hogan and most of the other figures here. And it's a great head sculpt. The head is massive. Just really happy with it. I like the play pose. The open hands I think are great for Andre. We can mimic some of those slaps and chops and chokes. So great stuff there. If I'm being a stickler, maybe we could have got those mutton chop sideburns, because I seem to remember Andre the Giant with the big sideys, but I don't know if he had that the whole time, or maybe that was just some notable matches that kind of stick in my memory. But mutton chops aside, a fantastic Andre the Giant figure. A chunky, tall figure with some serious heft for the small 4-inch Hasbro line. The spring-loaded action features a little bit of an unusual one. We've got the spring-loaded hips, so I'm assuming Andre can throw a headbutt. I don't know if I would have used that as a kid particularly if I had this figure then, but that's okay. It's one of these play features where it doesn't really get in the way of regular, you know, wrestling action if you had this as a kid. So all in all, a great Andre the Giant figure. I mentioned the scale was spot on with Andre the Giant. I definitely can't say the same about the next figure, and that's the Big Boss Man. Now I know the Big Boss Man was never a physique guy. Sure, he trimmed up later in his career, but he was never rocking the abs. But this figure is so plump. It's crazy. And aside from the belly, the figure's really small, particularly the head. The head on this figure is absolutely tiny. So the proportions are certainly all over the place. But at the end of the day, they go back to Hasbro's MO of being cartoony and wacky and almost like caricatures, where they kind of hone in on the defining features of the figure, whether it's apparel or whether it's, you know, face paint or all those kinds of things. And I guess Hasbro saw the defining feature of the Big Boss Man as his gut. But while the proportions are all over the place with the Big Boss Man Series 1 figure, I actually like what's going on as far as the paint applications go, because the defining characteristics of the entrance attire are all there. You know, the pants and the shirt with lots of detail, like the Big Boss Man insignia and the, you know, the corrections officer badge and the kind of shoulder tassels and the yellow line on the black trousers. They're actually captured really nicely. The shades are captured really nicely. The flat top haircut is perfect. And another excellent accessory in the nightstick, an absolute no-brainer as far as an accessory goes, because definitely an accessory that you would use. And if I had this as a kid, I'd have other figures taking the nightstick off the Big Boss Man and using it against him, and you'd have all sorts of fun. You could have your nightstick on a pole match, and you could play out all sorts of awesome angles with this figure as a kid. So yeah, it's definitely some good and bad with the Big Boss Man. The proportions are all over the place, but the actual features of his entrance attire are fantastic. The accessory is wonderful. The action feature is a very simple one. So just a bit of a smackdown of that nightstick works really nicely. So definitely some redeeming features on this figure, and in this case a super clean version, so one that I'm really happy to have in the collection. So there you have it, Series 1 Big Boss Man. If we're talking Big Boss Man, let's talk his tag team partner Akeem, the African Dream. Ridiculous gimmick aside, there's not too much to say about this figure. It's a good figure in that it's instantly recognizable and it captures all of the key features of Akeem's attire. And once again, you know, we've got Akeem here depicted in the yellow and blue entrance attire. We've got a good play pose. We've got the same spring-loaded action feature as Andre the Giant. I'm not sure if this is supposed to be a reflection of any specific maneuver that Akeem did in the ring or just the weird dance moves that he used to pull. But once again, classic Hasbro WWF action. It's fun, it's colourful, it's cartoony, and another good addition for Series 1 of the line. So we've spoken about the Twin Towers. Let's look at the other tag team in Series 1 of the Hasbro line, and I'm talking about these awesome Demolition figures. Now, I think Hasbro nailed these figures. Any characters that have defining features of their appearance, like face paint or really unique ring attire or entrance attire, I think are perfectly set up to make great Hasbro figures, with the exception of the Ultimate Warrior, of course, but we won't go back there. And Demolition are no exception. These figures are fantastic. We've got the face paint captured beautifully. Even beyond the face paint, I think the face likenesses are great. A lot of detail on the relatively simple ring attire. So even though we've got ring attire here or entrance attire that could be depicted fairly simply on these figures, they're sculpted and they contain a lot of the silver metallic painted studs. So just figures that are captured wonderfully. I really like these Demolition figures. We've got two different play poses, two different action features. So in the case of Smash, we've got the pretty simple uppercut. And then in the case of Axe, we've got that gorilla press action feature that we got with Hulk Hogan, which once again, to have this figure as a kid, thinking about it, the open hands down by the sides makes it a little bit difficult to kind of carry out normal play with. But I love the fact that they got two different action features, two different play poses. You know, it would have been pretty simple for Hasbro just to chuck two different heads on the same body, but I think they nailed it with these two figures. Now, I actually display my Demolition figures with these two awesome helmet accessories. Now, these weren't released with the figures in Series 1. Demolition got a later release in the Hasbro line where we got a re-release of Smash along with Crush, a later edition of Demolition. And when Smash and Crush were released, they came with these two awesome helmets or masks that perfectly reflect the entrance masks of Demolition at the time. I managed to get my hands on a third one, so now Axe gets a mask and I get to display all these guys all masked up, which I think is just great. But once again, they didn't have the masks when these two figures were released in Series 1. So this is how they were released in Series 1 in 1990. And in 1990, just a no-brainer for the line. As we start 1990, Demolition are the WWF Tag Team Champions. I believe they dropped the belts to the Hart Foundation later on in 1990. So assuming these figures were developed in 1989, just a perfect addition, one of the key tag teams in the WWF at the time. Growing up, I was always a Legion of Doom guy myself, but still got a lot of time for Demolition and a lot of time for these two Demolition figures. These are awesome. Next up, we've got one of my childhood favorite wrestlers, Jake the Snake Roberts. Now, I love Jake the Snake Roberts growing up. Coming out to the ring with Damien the Python or with his King Cobra, leaving them perched in the corner of the ring, just waiting to unleash them on one of his opponents, most famously Macho Man Randy Savage. I'll never forget Jake Roberts tying up Randy Savage in the ring ropes and then unleashing the Cobra to bite him. That was just crazy for a kid to see back in the day. But it's not just about the snakes. Jake's personality really resonated with me as a kid. I used to love his mic work. As far as finishing moves go, they really don't come much cooler than the DDT. And I actually got to see Jake Roberts perform live at an indie show here in Australia in 1993. So that was wicked. But enough about that. Let's talk this figure, and I really like this figure. once again, it's just recognizably Jake the Snake Roberts. I think the trunks came out nice. We've got a simplified version of the snakeskin boots, which I love. We've got a play pose, which just lends itself to easy play. The spring-loaded action feature is an unusual one. It's one that we've not seen yet, and that's like a straight arm with a spring that allows you to throw a punch. Now, I wouldn't have used this as a kid. I find it a little bit clumsy, but importantly, you can use it or not use it. The spring-loaded play feature doesn't define the play pose of the figure. We've got a closed fist that we could just use for punching, for clotheslines, all sorts of things. I think the face sculpt is really simple, but to me, very recognizable of Jake the Snake Roberts. So a great figure before you take into account the accessory. But then we've got this awesome snake accessory. And it's a beautiful snake on its own to just look at as a standalone piece, but it becomes even better when we wrap it around the Jake Roberts figure, because it's perfectly scaled and perfectly shaped to just flow around him really naturally. You know, we've got the tail section fits in Jake's hand, and it just, I mean, this just looks perfect. I absolutely love this figure. Definitely one of my favorites in the line, not just because Jake is one of my childhood favorite wrestlers. I think this is just a damn cool figure. So one of my favorites in the line, Jake the Snake Roberts, Series 1, 1990. And let's bring it home with a couple of figures that, if I'm honest, I don't love. The first one being the flamboyant Brutus the Barber Beefcake. Now, I don't remember Brutus Beefcake much for his in-ring work, if I'm honest. I can't think of like a defining Brutus Beefcake match from my childhood. I remember him way more for the barbershop interview segment, which was spoken about on this channel previously, with the Rockers famously, you know, going their separate ways and exploding on the barbershop segment when Shawn Michaels super kicked Marty Jannetty through the plate glass window. I remember Brutus Beefcake for just his flamboyant entrance attire, the garden shears, cutting opponents' hair after a match, after putting them to sleep in the sleeper hold, things like that. I'm not a huge fan of this figure for the most part, just simply due to, once again, having that fused leg play pose with the lump on the back so we can, you know, launch him off the top rope, which seems like it's an action feature that it's a little bit lost on Brutus Beefcake, because once again, I don't remember him doing crazy aerial maneuvers off the top rope, but I could just be misremembering his style because I don't have a lot of specific in-ring Brutus Beefcake memories from my childhood. But aside from the fused legs, spring-loaded torso, play pose and action feature, which I loathe, there are some redeeming qualities to the figure. I do like the fishnet fingerless gloves. The wild expression in the face sculpt is an interesting one. It's an interesting depiction of Brutus Beefcake. I really like the garden shears accessory. I think that's a fantastic accessory. And the snipping hand gesture on the right hand is an interesting touch as well. So not without its decent features, but certainly not one of the better figures in the Hasbro WWF Series 1. And last of all, we have the ravishing one, Ravishing Rick Rude. Now, as a young wrestling fan in 1990, I really only caught on to the tail end of Rick Rude's run in the WWF, but I still find him a really underrated performer in terms of his in-ring work. Now, in 1990, he was very much on the way out of the WWF, but still played a key role as he feuded with the Ultimate Warrior once the Warrior won the WWF title from Hulk Hogan. So he was in a high-profile feud with the Warrior, so it still makes sense for the 1990 line. But with that said, there's not a lot about this figure that I like. The figure is really small. Now, I know Rick Rude wasn't jacked. He wasn't super bulky. He was obviously shredded. You know, he had a 16 pack, so it makes sense that it's a lean figure, but this figure is really small and has a really weird play pose. I'm assuming this play pose is designed to kind of put your opponent in a headlock, and then you've got this spring-loaded left hand to punch the head of your opponent while he's in the headlock. But I don't feel like this lends itself really well to the Rick Rude persona. If anything, this arm being up in like a flex for the ladies, that feels like it makes a little bit more sense with Rick Rude. That's how I tend to display this figure. You know, a fair face sculpt. I don't think that face screams Rick Rude. And I do quite like the purple trunks, but I remember Rick Rude having like wildly outrageous trunks with like ladies' faces all over them. So I do feel a little bit like Hasbro dropped the ball just with the plain purple and black trunks. So not an awful lot I like about this figure. And I don't mean to finish on a down note, but Rick Rude rounds out your Series 1 1990 WWF Hasbro wrestling figure line. So there you have the complete Wave 1 of Hasbro's WWF action figures. Some awesome figures, some not so awesome ones, but look, even though some of these figures aren't great, they're still super nostalgic for me and a whole generation of wrestling fans. And when I was into wrestling as a kid, I was super into wrestling, and I didn't play with any other action figures for that period of time apart from the Hasbros. Now, as far as notable absences from the line, there are a couple. Roddy Piper and Sergeant Slaughter were still very much key players in 1990. Earthquake had a pretty big push in 1990 as he feuded with Hulk Hogan after Hogan dropped the belt to the Warrior. And Mr. Perfect was also getting a big push because, from what I understand, Mr. Perfect was touted to win the 1990 Royal Rumble before Hogan used his backstage influence to change the course of events. And also, after the Warrior unified the WWF title and the Intercontinental title and was forced to relinquish the Intercontinental title, the next IC champ was Mr. Perfect. So it would have made sense for Mr. Perfect to feature in this series. But again, those were the events of 1990. I'm sure these figures were in development well prior to that. And besides, all of those 4 wrestlers that I mentioned, they got figures in later waves. So all in all, Hasbro did well in terms of covering the main players for Wave 1. As far as my favourite and least favourite from the line, I love the Macho Man Randy Savage figure. I love the Jake the Snake Roberts figure. And I might be cheating here, but I would have Demolition rounding out my top 3. Demolition, I'm counting them as one entry. I love these 2 figures. And then Hulk Hogan has to get an honourable mention just because of how iconic this visual is. Just this Hulkster figure, although it's not perfect, although there's some things I don't like about it, super iconic, super nostalgic, so the Hulkster gets an honourable mention. As far as my least favourite figures, I don't love the Brutus the Barber Beefcake figure because of that fused leg play feature. I don't love Rick Rude because of the weird scale and the fact that I think the face sculpt doesn't look like him, and the trunks being a defining attire of what Rick Rude wore, they've not been captured particularly well. But the absolute least favourite, my most disliked figure in Series 1 of the Hasbro line has to be the Ultimate Warrior, just because I think Hasbro absolutely dropped the ball on this figure. He could have been incredible. He was incredible when we got later releases of the Ultimate Warrior, which we'll talk about when I review the later waves. Once I complete them, I've still got a few figures I'm chasing, but at least for now, Series 1 Ultimate Warrior is my least favourite. So that'll do us for today's episode. I hope you enjoyed my review of Series 1 of the Hasbro WWF line. If you've hung around this far, you're a dead set champion, so thank you very much. And we'll look at Series 2 as soon as I can complete it, and I just need the Dusty Rhodes figure and I need Hacksaw Jim Duggan's 2x4. If you're located in Australia and you have either of those, please reach out to me in the comments or on Instagram at Crusher Collects, because I want to buy those off you. The sooner I complete them, the sooner I can take a close look at Series 2 in one of these review videos. Let me know if you had any of these figures as a kid. I would love to hear your childhood memories of the Hasbro line, so hit me up in the comments. Hope to hear from you there. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, cheers.